Welcome everyone, good afternoon. Welcome to the EFG webinar titled Tackling the 21st Century Water Quality Challenges for Managed Aquifer Recharge. My name is Tamás Madarász. I will be the host of today's webinar. I'm the member of the European Federation of Geologists panel of experts on hydrogeology. I'm a geologist engineer and a faculty member at the University of Miskolc, Hungary, and heading the Institute of Environmental Management. As many of you probably know, the European Federation of Geologists is periodically organizing webinars to foster professional development for the geologists and also to increase public awareness of about the importance of geosciences. And as a part of this series, this afternoon, the topic will be related to hydrogeology, and within that, especially to a very important topic, which is becoming more and more important in many parts of the world, which is managed aquifer recharge. And I'm delighted to present the speaker of today's webinar, Dr. Zheng. Dr. Zheng became the chair professor at the Southern University of Science and Technology in Shenzhen, China, in 2016. She obtained her PhD from Columbia University in 1999. Between 1998 and 2016, she held tenured faculty and administrative appointments at the City University of New York and research appointments at Columbia University. She was a water and sanitation specialist with UNICEF Bangladesh between 2009 and 2011. Currently, she serves as the editor-in-chief for Environmental Earth Sciences and as co-chair for the International Association of Hydrogeologists Managing Aquifer Research Commission. She completed multidisciplinary research and contributed significantly to the reduction of exposure to arsenic among private well households in Bangladesh, China, and USA. She extensively publishes in geochemistry, hydrogeology, environmental health, and policy. Professor Zheng was elected as Fellow of the Geological Society of America in 2010 and a Fellow of the American Geophysical Union in 2021. So we are privileged to have Dr. Zheng as the speaker of today's webinar. Just as an information, during Dr. Zheng's presentation, you will find the Q&A section open for questions. So even while the presentation is on, questions are welcomed, submitted to the Q&A section. If we have abundance of questions arriving at the end of the webinar, we will select the most interesting and most relevant questions. And with that, I would like to pass on the word to Dr. Zheng. Please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Tamás, for your kind introduction. First of all, I'm very pleased to be giving this webinar today to the European Federation of Geologists, and thank you for this extending this kind invitation. This is the a talk that I have many people to credit for, and I will try to acknowledge them as I go along. So this is the outline, and I will just take a minute to say that I will mainly focus on the first one, which is the science part, and maybe I will dwell on the other two parts, which I think are absolutely essential, but most of the times hydrogeologists don't think about that enough. I will start by saying this is the managed aquifer recharge definition, which is available on the IHMR Commission's website, and it was developed over time by this Commission's various past and present co-chairs. So what's really important to recognize is that we do this for purpose. And when we put water purposefully into aquifers, we have the intention either to recover that for use, there are a wide range of uses, or in recent years, we're beginning to see that this is also being applied to enhance ecological flow or other environmental benefits. So I will start by also pointing out that all the groundwater ill, groundwater pollution specifically, really starts from nearly all the times, at least the anthropogenically made ones, from the surface. And this is typically unmanaged. So we categorically call this incidental or unmanaged recharge. And even though this picture may represent a rural setting, but if you have active farm, as we know, we can have lots of pesticides or fertilizer pollution to groundwater. So what distinguishes this, this activity, which is this particular one here, is managed aquifer recharge refers to infrastructure like this recharge basin that we build with the purpose to enhance recharge to the aquifer for either recovery or environmental benefits. Needless to say, in urban environments, we have lots of issues. We have sewer pipes, we have industrial activity. Essentially, all of these unmanaged or incidental recharges goes to pollute groundwater. So managed aquifer recharge really does not try to solve all the problems. We focus on these infrastructure. But as we go broader, I think we need to start to pay attention to how humans have fundamentally changed the patterns of recharge, either with time and space. So before I move on to the three parts, I would like to really sort of just use two slides to give away the take-home messages. So you can see on the right part of the slide, these water resource infrastructure, which we collectively known as MAR technology. They could either be surface-based, a lot of basins, ditches, or sometimes we use the unsaturated zones, the so-called soil aquifer treatment. Very popular in Europe is riverbank filtration, which means you pull the river water through the aquifer and then that's naturally filtered. And then you can have the subsurface infrastructure, mostly various kinds of recharge wells. But most importantly, you can also use water of different quality. You can have very good quality water in general, natural water, and sometimes even water fit for drinking. And increasingly urban stormwater or rural floodwater have been used. And also very popular are recycled water, which is going to be a major focus of this talk. So people have been doing MAR for, let's say, nearly 100 years, maybe even longer, maybe perhaps not intentionally. So in this year, because it's International Year of Groundwater, I led this article, which was developed with colleagues from Irish MAR Commission with contributions from Joe Van de Zem and Niels Hartog. So basically, we argued to make MAR more useful for the world to manage water resources better. We need to resolve these governance challenges. And I also want to point out to you, Peter Dillon has led a whole book that's now also published by IAH and available on our website. I will not talk about this water rights part, which itself is very interesting. And today I will focus on water quality risk, and the solution is in the title that we need to move towards a risk-based regulatory approach, which I'll explain. And I would also like to refer you to a publication that was released by UNESCO in 2021, and it's also available to download for free. And in this book, we collected 28 successful MAR cases using various source water for different purposes. And after getting all of this together, I think it is for the first time we really collected a set of evidence that MAR is really good to integrate surface water and groundwater management, and also to recycle water. And there were 9 European cases in this book. So if you're coming from any of these countries, you might find or know these colleagues who's working on them. So with that, I'll move to the first part, which is what are these 21st century water quality challenges? What am I talking about? So as a point of introduction, I like to point out Johan Rockström published a paper in Nature in 2009, and he articulated that there is this sort of safe operating space for the 9 planetary system, the Earth system. So in this, this comes from the main driver was people studying climate change, are we exceeding the capacity, etc. And he did put this chemical pollution, and it's not clear whether we have exceeded the safe operating space or not. And following that, 6 years later, Stefan et al. In Science renamed chemical pollution to make it broader. They renamed it novel entities. So essentially these novel chemical, basically a lot of synthetic chemicals that now are made by human. And then also biological entities, for example, coronavirus being one. So are they sort of leading us down the path that are we operating in this unsafe operating space? So this is sort of interesting. This is sort of like risk assessment at Earth system scale, which is obviously very, very difficult and challenging. So, so for us, the lesson is obviously we need to start to pay attention to these novel entities, and they seems to be getting more and more. Okay, so then some of these other things, how do we historically deal with these water quality risks? We have water quality standards. Where do they come from? They basically came from toxicology assessment. I actually did my undergraduate thesis in this field, and I apologize, this is only in Chinese. It's only in Chinese, but what you can see is these compound here. Maybe I should point, sorry. These compound here and their metabolite, they have different ways of influencing our health, but we don't necessarily study them using human subjects. So we do them in cell, various other ways. But the idea is we understand dose response, and then we combine with epidemiological studies. And in the end, we say how we can set a maximum contaminant level. Humans should not be exposed to this chemical above certain level. The trouble is we have now so many chemicals, and all of this is done at a very, very different scale, which traditionally these MCLs fed into, say, for example, managed aquifer recharge. You have 100+ water quality things you need to measure. Did we exceed them? To what extent we exceed them? We do a risk assessment. But more and more, because there's so many things we need to worry about, it appears at this point, we don't have a way of connecting the two. And we also have the ethical issues that also remain to be unresolved. Whenever we do this, in this case, manage aquifer recharge, using aquifer to store water, to clean up water, whatever you do, is the goal, should we prioritize protecting human health or the aquifer? And what is it in the aquifer? Of course, they are aquatic organisms in the river, and because we typically talk about surface water and groundwater connection, but then there are also life forms underground. There are microbes, can't see them, but they're still life. And then what do you mean by protecting groundwater and protecting soil? So this gets very tricky. And of course, historically, nearly all the environmental standards are set to protect human health. So because all of these risks are uncertain and life has to go on. So a few years ago, when we wrote a grant to Danita to work on managed aquifer recharge in China, we said, oh, because we have all of these things, even though when river infiltrate, when you have riverbank filtration, you do some of that. So maybe that's clean up something. So we probably shouldn't directly inject surface water into the deep aquifer. We probably should take whatever that's in the shallow groundwater and do that. So we call that due stage. And it turns out we're not the only ones who had this idea. And Halur et al. In Germany, when they started Berlin, they sort of named this as a sequential MAR technology, or SMART, but although their idea is slightly different. So basically, we ought to think about sort of a layered structure of the aquifer and how to take advantage of that. So to the right here is a figure of Baoding Plain, which we'll come back to later. But this is where the south to north water runs in the sort of the front of the Piedmont area. And water from that is being released into these rivers and is being currently recharged to the unconfined aquifer mostly. But the drawdown, the groundwater depletion, is actually in the confined aquifer. So kind of doesn't directly address it if you only recharge the shallow aquifer. So, and then finally, one of the main utilities of MAR is to filter out these pathogens. They either die off because lack of nutrients or other mechanisms. So MAR is great because it's an engineering tool, because we can regulate the hydraulic retention time. This is the case in coastal Australia, a coastal aquifer that was otherwise brackish. So reclaimed water was gone through the wetland when the injection well, stored in the aquifer, and then put out in a different location. So this is being shown to be great in recycling reclaimed water, even to drinking water quality, although this obviously is expensive. So I will not dwell, you can read for Page et al.'s article on the log reduction of virus and other pathogens in systems like this. What I'll do next is I'll focus on my group's work on biodegradation of trace organic contaminants. And this was funded by Danita. And in work package 2, we are looking at precisely those questions. These are the colleagues from GILS before the pandemic time. And for this part, we collaborated very closely with Jans Amont. So, one of the things that really changed in a lot of places, but particularly in China in the last decade, was we have a totally different waterscape. Previously, there's not much capacity for treating wastewater. In 10 years, nearly all the cities and towns have built wastewater treatment facility. So when this happens, before you just discharged wastewater into the river, now you discharge treated wastewater. And then of course, we call that environmental reuse. So this has really shot up a lot. This little red bar shows what happened in Beijing, which is where one of our study sites. SUSTech in Shenzhen, which is very close to Hong Kong. And we also have a Central Park. So this is basically reclaimed water. However, this water still contains pathogens. So you can't really go play in the water, so which is an issue. But if you had MAR, then you will not have this problem. So this is the Beijing study site. This is the surface water, and this is the major river, that's the Beiyun River. 90% of the flow is reclaimed water. We basically collect all the wastewater treatment plants effluent and then goes out. So, and you can see the shallow groundwater quality, these red and purple, pretty bad. Of course, it's not just due to reclaimed water flowing in the river alone. Historically, there are other issues as well. This is in sort of like a peri-urban area. So what my student Yu Xia, she's this one with half her face shown. She took sample from the sediment sample from these riverbed and also sediment core from the Baoding Plain. So the Baoding Plain are much deeper aquifer that yields groundwater, and these are riverbed sediments. What we found was when we incubated this organic rich riverbed sediments released quite a bit of arsenic, but the organic poor Baoding Plain sediment didn't. It turns out during managed aquifer recharge, arsenic release, sort of the secondary pollution, is a major issue. It is particularly noteworthy is actually in the Netherlands when they voluntarily lowered their drinking water standard to 1 microgram per liter. So, so we were pleased to see if water is infiltrated, recharged into the North China Plain aquifer, such as in Baoding Plain, we are unlikely going to trigger much arsenic release. But if you do riverbank filtration, you may need to deal with this, just like what's happening in the Netherlands. So moving on, postdoc Yun Jiema, she's the person who's sitting next to Yisha in the previous photo. She did actually these experiments in goose. So in her first paper, we basically studied sulfonamides, these 3 antibiotics. We chose antibiotics because antibiotics resistance is a big issue. So we thought they're a little bit more interesting to study than many other trace organic contaminants. So this sulfonamides has this group here, which you can see, amine and sulfhydryl. And then in her batch experiment, she basically found this biotransformation is the major degradation pathway, more than sorption, more than mineralization. In the column experiment, she also found substrate is a major limitation. But most importantly, we find a lot of unknown metabolites, very concerning. So just a little bit of a detail. So in her batch experiment paper, she incubated Beiyun River sediment, the same ones that Yusha did incubation for looking for arsenic release. She added these antibiotics to them and then watched how they went. So what I wanted to emphasize is that she compared the removal by sorption, mineralization, and biodegradation. And you can see that sorption really doesn't matter too much. And mineralization, which means go straight to CO2, really is very tiny. So with time, you do see antibiotic under oxidant conditions, they do biodegrade. But when we try to measure the intermediate product, which is this yellow part, there's only, we measure 3 of them. We have standards for 3 of them. So we can quantify the intermediate products. So you can see they didn't become CO2. They disappeared. We only could find a little bit of it, which means this difference here are all of these unknown metabolites. If you don't know what they are, then it's going to become very difficult to assess their toxicity and environmental impact. So in anoxic conditions, we actually see a reversal. So these things can actually revert back, and these metabolites are unstable. When the conditions changes, they become antibiotics again. So, so this is very sort of humbling results, which makes us a lot to reckon with these unknown metabolites. So in the study, so she also looked at the degradation kinetics, and we can see that they are sort of, on the orders of days, half time, or, maybe a month or two. And she also discussed this pathway that when you have them, they basically break apart into two smaller pieces, which is fairly typical of these larger compounds. Or if they only change a little bit, you drop an amine group, and that's why when you go back, you see this. So one of the very important lesson I hope you take away is that when you do these risk assessment engineering, it's very dangerous just to measure disappearances of trace organic contaminants. Because if they disappear, it doesn't mean it becomes something less toxic or less concerning. They just became something else. They didn't become something harmless. And then they also tend to hang around quite a bit. We also don't know the fate of all of these metabolites that are intermediate. So this creates basically a problem that's not trackable anymore. So we also did in situ experiments. This was a work by PhD student Meng Ma. We injected bromide and SMX into this well in this experimental field. All of these are experimental wells. So we're allowed to do this at the site because it's an experimental site. And you can see that by difference, bromide is inert, or we take it as so. And you can see SMX is less than that. So you can estimate the disappearance, which we can then sort of assess the kinetics. So these rates are slightly different from the lab studies and field study. Why they are so, we still don't yet have the answer. So, the basic lesson is that, yes, storage is good, and preferably since you have a compound that's somewhat degradable, but they don't degrade all the way to CO2. So you probably want to prolong the storage time to much longer than we presently thinking about. So simply because we don't know how these things behave in the environment. And currently, Yunji is writing up her column experiment results. In this experiment, we put the sediment from the river between one thin and one thick layer of sand, and she dripped water through this with antibiotics, and sometimes added more carbon, sometimes added ammonia. So this hydraulic retention time was at most 3 days, sometimes shorter. We didn't see much removal at all in across. And when we did see some removal, that's particularly when we had substrate added. So that's why we say removal is limited by substrates and reaction time. So to wrap up this science part, we found that the incidental recharge, so if you don't manage reclaimed water, they still recharge in subsurface, in the river, wherever they went, they will seep into. And this process will introduce a huge amount of not so biodegradable contaminants and emerging concerns. Here we looked at antibiotics, but there are others who looked at other pharmaceuticals, PPCPs, and so on and so forth. So it's a matter of time that we will see them in deeper groundwater, and hopefully we had already figured out what happened to them. And then when we think about their biodegradation specifically, when it comes to the sulfonamide antibiotics, we found that they are redox dependent. They're also quite incomplete, and there are a lot of unknown metabolites. And the degradation is variable depending on substrate and all of these other things, and also retention time. So what do we do then? Well, we need to come up with better regulations to basically deal with this. So we need to learn ways of dealing with unknown risks. I know there's a precautionary principle, but I feel at this time, we need to move a little bit beyond that. So which is now the second part. So science-wise, we are continue to work on accelerate and enhance biodegradation, including providing more substrates or slow down or enhance storage time. So there will still be a lot of things to do when it comes to the specifics of developing the kind of MAR technology that can handle these novel entities. So that's the most important part of my talk today. So very quickly in the next 10 minutes, I'll go through the reasons for MAR regulations. So Kathleen Stefan, who's another co-chair of IHMA Commission, he's based in TU Dresden in Germany. He had spearheaded this inventory thing, and you can see there are a lot of MAR attempted all over the world. But if you look at the actual quantity of water that's recycled, it's only 1% globally. So this was summarized nicely in Peter Dillon's hydrogeology paper, appeared in 2019. So we can track that data to 60 years, but MAR started way before that. And many places underutilized MAR. It would be nice to see this number goes up to 10%, but it hasn't. So why? Well, the first reason is that we really don't have a set of clear, even guiding principles in governance. And this amplifies a whole series of reasons, which I list here, which you can read. But basically, we're very afraid we don't have enough scientific understanding, and a lot of places are limited by engineering know-how, and more importantly, many places don't have governance instruments. So this was nicely put together and summarized in this book, which I highly recommend you to read. So to just give you one example, how this can be a barrier. In China, this was hailed as a great success. The groundwater management regulation of China 2021 finally came codified, but it says artificial recharge groundwater shall comply with the relevant water quality standards and should never deteriorate groundwater quality. What does that mean? Never deteriorate. Okay, so even when you just let water go in, you can trigger arsenic release. You're gonna have these contaminants of emerging concern. You cannot avoid them. So basically, this is mission impossible. So for example, this is in Taobai River, where the south to north water diversion water is going in. And you are going to face water quality challenges. And then just to give you an idea how prevalent these contaminants are, Professor Yin Guangguo's group in Guangzhou, they've tracked these with very fancy non-target analysis and identified 402 trace supply of Guangzhou, which is a mega city. So in this past summer, we went around and sampled groundwater to try to figure out how widespread this phenomenon is. So we can't avoid them. If you measure them, you find them. And then at the same time, the MAR has shown to be highly successful. This is the case included in the MAR book, the UNESCO MAR book from France, where these reed pond basically recharges the coastal aquifer to polish the wastewater treatment effluent. And when you measure what goes in versus what you can pump out at the other side of the monitoring well, you see very large reduction of nitrogen, which is very important if you don't want to have coastal eutrophication, but more importantly, also some of these contaminants of emerging concerns. So obviously we want to do this also, and Shenzhen is a coastal city. We're currently looking at this small wastewater treatment plant, which puts treated wastewater into this creek and then directly into coastal sea. There's quite a bit of nitrogen in this discharge. So presumably some sort of a similar treatment would be desirable, but because of this should never deteriorate groundwater quality, we're running into a lot of issues, even though this coastal aquifer is brackish. And this brackish coastal aquifer is also a great storage place in Bangladesh. When I was with UNICEF, I initiated with colleagues in the water sanitation section that we stored pond water, which is fresh and abundant during the rainy season, and through sand filters and then through these recharge wells, essentially creates a freshwater bubble so the villagers can take the water out for use during the wet seasons. Here, this water is much, much better in terms of microbial water quality, but we do run into some problems of arsenic remobilization. So the last part is then what do we do? In the MAR book, we have 28 cases and 9 of them in Europe. So wherever you are, you may be able to find something relevant to you. What I wanted to convince you is that Andrew Ross has done analysis and has showed data for each case, what's the cost per cubic meter of water recovered. And RBF, which is very popular in Europe, is very cheap. And most importantly, combined, MAR is only half the cost of the best available alternatives. And also I've written up a chapter where MAR is demonstrated to be sustainable. One of the key parameters is you look at the volume recovery and versus recharge, because you don't want to over extract. So this is for all the cases. That's the 1-to-1 line. And I would just run this for your benefit because I know this is a European audience. So I pull out the 9 cases from Europe. The red are source water, are wastewater, and the blue are the RBFs. And you can see they vary in size. They have different energy intensity, which is also another important measure. And then most importantly, all of these cases received a sustainability rating rated by myself and Peter Dillon as good. And you might ask, how do you rate sustainability? So I really encourage all of you in your work, if you work in MAR, to try to apply this indicator system. So the 6 are for environmental sustainability. So water quantity, water quality, ecosystem service, and stressor, which is measured by energy consumption. And then this final part, the 3-part, is the social sustainability indicators, which has the regulatory framework. So places where MAR had guidelines, like in Australia, or a very clear-cut management act basically says whoever takes water out has to put it back. That's in Arizona. Has led to a flourishing of applications on MAR. And particularly in Arizona, this groundwater banking credit has been very important. So the innovations in financial instruments. So what I wanted to end is this attenuation zone concept originated in Australia in the guideline basically says, well, if you put water into the aquifer, maybe for a small part of the region, you will see more contamination compared to whatever it was. But over the distance, this is naturally treated. So this allows for example, infiltration of reclaimed water. So more relevantly for Europe, I found this report highly valuable towards a water reuse regulatory instrument at EU level. And they also identify the barrier of reclaimed water use is basically harmonization of health and environmental risk. So the same issue I illustrated earlier. And they also summarize what the Australian did. Australia basically put their MAR under the water recycling framework, which is a very helpful thing. And likewise in California, because it's a dry place, they're being always very careful with their water. So when it comes to this, they also had this risk assessment and multi-barrier principle. So, and they also highlight you need to involve a lot of different expertise if you want to manage your groundwater well. So the EU report recommend harmonized regulatory framework to protect groundwater and to recycle water. So I know recently the EU directive has been released for the agricultural use of reclaimed water, and it's a minimum requirement water quality. And here in this paper, we articulate risk-based for MAR. And what is risk-based? I'll just explain very quickly. We should view MAR as part of the treatment train. We really should integrate this as part of the engineering system when we think about wastewater treatment. And you have to either treat the water before you recharge or treat the water before you use, and the MAR has a role to play. And in order not to mess up the groundwater too much, there are several ways of how do we manage this when we recharge. We are basically held to higher standards than the incidental recharge because, well, nobody was doing it on purpose, so you can just let the water go, but that presumably pollutes as well. Most places use this prescriptive management approach. So you set a water quality standards and you say, follow this. The trouble is there's so many chemicals, you will not have the energy or time to really do it. So anyways, the risk-based is aimed at managing the risk, usually the dailies. That also presumably requires the toxicology knowledge, which can be dealt with maybe a little bit better than the MCO approach. But I feel this is a field that really needs growth. And on the right here are the pathogen removal time. So the storage time, if you, for example, want to remove a rotavirus, which gives a lot of people diarrhea. So that is a very important advantage. So to wrap up, so in this paper that appeared in the International Groundwater Year Hydrogeology Journal, we basically articulate, look, let us have an attenuation zone in the aquifer. And in fact, aquifer really should be managed by hydrogeologist view. So, you know, we manage space, we make zones. So different parts of the aquifer, unconfined, confined, should have different purposes. They should really not be managed just based on surface features. So to conclude, the MAR regulations should be part of the water recycling and reuse regulations, and a risk-based approach over a prescriptive parametric approach is highly desirable, which will likely reduce cost of monitoring and also a lot of other costs. And if you want to do this regulation, you need to have expertise across a very wide range of fields. And finally, I didn't have time to talk about this. We have the ecocentric or anthropocentric ethics, but perhaps we need to develop a communitarian ethics and also consider the precautionary principle. So thank you. And these two books are here and you can look it up. It's on IH, recharge.ih, our website. And I'm also editor-in-chief of Environmental Earth Sciences. So if you have manuscripts, we publish a lot of groundwater stuff, so you're welcome to submit your original research also to us. And if you have any questions, this is my email. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jan. Thank you for the interesting presentation, for the scientific, regulatory, and other aspects, and also for the additional information. We have time for a couple of questions. Actually, we have 2 written questions submitted to the Q&A menu. Everyone, all participants are welcome to submit further questions if you have. The first question, if I understand correctly, the question is interested about case study in Italy. I think the question refers to whether you are aware of any case studies from Italy. And I think
there is one.
Slides you already gave some answer, right?
Yes. There's a case that we included in the book, so you're welcome to download the book. Yeah.
Okay. The other question, when it comes to biodegradation, are there some microbes, plants, fungi identified for the metabolization of the studied antibiotics contaminants?
There are some mechanisms. I'm not sure there are specific microorganisms that people have isolated. So we do know, for example, when we try to do 16S RNA or we can do the metagenomics, you can see certain associations. I'm not sure about plants or fungi, but microbes for sure. They play a role in metabolism, and the way we're looking at this problem now, for a lot of people, we think it's co-metabolism. Basically, microbes are not basically using antibiotics as food on purpose. They were using other food, and then by chance, they also used it. So, because they're also, you have to remember, these are very trace levels, typically nanograms per liter. Yeah.
Okay. Meanwhile, I recognize that we have questions coming to the chat window as well. So please submit your question to the Q&A. That would make it more easier. An anonymous attendee asked a question. He acknowledges that he joined the webinar too late, but his question is whether the managed aquifer recharge is a model or a software.
It's a collection of technique, and it's a water resource infrastructure. It's neither a model nor a software. It's something you actually build in the real world to integrate surface water and groundwater resources.
Thank you. Another question which came to the chat window: what happens if the groundwater aquifer belongs to 2 countries?
Oh, transboundary aquifers, that is like a key for a lot of people. I'm not an expert, but in the MAR book, I do want to point out to you this Genovese aquifer, which is sits across the boundary between France and Switzerland, and they worked out, it took them a long time to work out a serious agreement to how to manage that and how to manage aquifer recharge that aquifer. So in the end, it worked out. It just took much longer time. Yeah.
Yeah. Before other questions might come in, I would like to ask the question to you, Zheng. You propose, and you in your presentation, I think you were very much for the risk-based approach and risk-based design of MAR technologies. By risk-based approach, you mean mainly human health and ecological risk assessment as a tool, or a wider range of risk assessment? In other words, I can also formulate the question in such a way that didn't you run into situations or even regulatory constraints where the system is designed based on health risk constraints or health risk criteria, but it's not sufficient because you directly recharge water, surface water or recycled water to the groundwater, to an environmental medium? Doesn't it cause a problem or an issue?
So this is something I think the regulatory and the hydrologists need to talk about and decide. Right now, everybody's confused. We don't agree even on the very simple guiding principles. For example, traditionally we say, when we say we want to protect groundwater, what do we mean? We really want to protect human health, because a lot of the times we use groundwater for drinking. So, but we don't explicitly say that. So when you have managed aquifer recharge, then you ought to think about, what am I going to use this water for later on, right? So, and it depends on the scale. If you're going to be water banking an entire aquifer over a few kilometers or, tens of cubic kilometer water, then it's a different issue than you're going to just put in some treated wastewater into a coastal aquifer and then pull it out for irrigation, which is, by the way, that was the case study in Dinteloord in the Netherlands. That's exactly what they did. So by adopting risk-based approach allows for a very wide range of possibilities. So you have to first define what risk you want to manage, and then you go from there. Because every case is a little different. If you're going to use, your end use is for agriculture, if your end use is for drinking, if your end use for, I don't know, environmental flow, then whatever you need to protect will need to have very different target. So, so obviously right now we're very cautious. We basically say we want to have an option to always use groundwater for drinking, let's say, right? But is it realistic, particularly in the unconfined aquifer, in many of these urban areas, or even in rural areas when we had massive fertilizer contamination? Is that aquifer kind of just, almost all finished? It's kind of too late. So what do you do in that case? So people are not willing to ask these hard questions and have meaningful discussions, because it's very easy to set a standard and say, nitrate should not exceed 10 milligram per liter, right? Well, of course you shouldn't if you're going to drink it, but if you're going to use it for irrigation, maybe that's perfect. So I think it's time for people in this field, hydrogeologists particularly, to make our voice heard. We really need to think about this very, very carefully and seriously, because for regulators, it's much easier to say, well, let's just stick to a number. Do not pollute, stay below this. You might have to spend a lot of money to pre-treat your water before you can recharge it into subsurface, right? Because if someday you say, well, the CEC's total concentration should not exceed X nanogram per liter, what are you going to do next? So
that's a dilemma. I think the Hungarian regulation can be very interesting in that regard, but that's beyond the scope of this discussion. We have one question. In your book, there was only one case study in Yunnan in China. How do you think about the ecological water replenishment in the North China Plain by south to north water diversion project in natural channel?
The case in the book is actually from the Jiaodong Peninsula. It's a very old case where underground water dam was built to prevent seawater intrusion and also to retain some of the excess flood water to allow use of that water for irrigation. So that's not in Jinan, it's in Shandong Peninsula, and it's for agriculture. We had a criteria about what case can make in. We typically only included cases that had been successful running, in operation for more than 10 years, because a lot of things start up and then they don't last and they fail. They don't last because they're either probably not a good idea to begin with, or too expensive, or they have some other side effects are not so desirable. So about the ecological water replenishment in the North China Plain, I think the jury is still out as to how beneficial that is. Someone needs to write papers to really analyze the improvement in water quantity and water quality, and more importantly, economics. Does it make sense economically to do this? Because if you can't afford it, then it won't last. So I'm curious. I really would love to see more research that's being done, because that's a lot of water being recharged or for this ecological water replenishment. So it would be really nice to see sound studies that seriously evaluate all the good and bad, and everything is good and bad, and as far as groundwater goes, there's never any one side of it. So so look forward to the research.
Thank you. There is one more question in the Q&A session. It's about negative cases or failing cases. Is there a recollection of managed aquifer recharge failing cases and reasons why they failed? Do you have any knowledge about that? I
would recommend you to look at the inventory, and the inventory had 1,000 cases also, and then you look at the actual, whether anything is actually ongoing, and you can figure out a lot of the times people have all the intentions to start something, but because of the one thing or the other, regulations, source water limitations, water quality concerns, costs and everything, or just people failure, then it doesn't work. So MAR sounds like a really wonderful idea, and it is, but to get it going well does require quite a bit of capacity and knowledge and determination. So that in the UNESCO book also tries to address that as well. So each case has a little bit of history of this. So it would be very good. I mean, if you want to know how they succeeded, you can imagine what the opposite. Anything could fail, even in the successful cases. So that's one thing, if you want to start a MAR, you want to think about.
Thank you so much. And with that, I think our time is over. I would like to thank you very much, Jan, for the interesting presentation, for your availability, and also being willing to answer the questions. I want to thank for all the participants for their involvement, also for the questions. And I would like to draw your attention about the upcoming seminars and webinars of EFG. Please follow the webpage, and wish you a nice day. Stay safe. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you, Enrique. One of my IHMAR co-chairs is in the audience. And also thank you, Mike Jones, who is a contributing author to the UNESCO book. Thank you for coming to the webinar today. It would be nice to see you at one of the future ISMAR meetings. Thank you, EFG, for your kind invitation. Thank you, Tamás, for hosting. Thank you.
You're welcome. It was my privilege. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.